Today's guest on Around the Coin is Geoff Thompson. He is the Chief Blockchain Officer at Roofstock. Roofstock has raised over $250 million at a $1.9 billion valuation, and they're in the business of prop tech. So Geoff specifically is working on integrating cryptocurrency into prop tech, specifically allowing tokenization of single-family rental properties. We talked about how they're doing that exactly and how that business and that concept should scale across the US and the world. We dived into some of the regulatory and philosophical perspectives on government's intervention in property laws, both from the municipality standpoint, the state, and then the federal government. And then we talked about new ideas in the future to potentially create sanctuary cities, to iterate and test on new property tech laws. So really mind expanding conversation with Geoff, and I hope you enjoy. If you do enjoy these conversations, please do give us a like or shout out, retweet wherever you're listening to the podcast. Really much appreciate it. Here is Geoff Thompson. All right, Geoff. So just like that, we're live. I'm excited to chat with you. You are currently the Chief Blockchain Officer at Roofstock. What does the Chief Blockchain Officer do on a day-to-day basis? And then sort of just pave the foundation a little bit by telling me what Roofstock is.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Mike. So Roofstock is a prop tech company. We've been around since 2015, did a Series E earlier this year. The focus has always been on making single-family rental homes more accessible as an asset class, both for institutional and retail investors. And the Web3 initiative, which is what I lead, is really the business unit that's dedicated to kind of bridging what we do right now with the next phase of technical innovation and blockchain. And so I kind of backed into this role and the title as well. I was previously General Counsel at the company, and earlier last year, there was some desire from leadership and the board to think about blockchain and can it help our mission to make real estate ownership more accessible and available. And we found that there is a way to do that, and it is that promise of blockchain of making things more transparent, more immediate, more direct, and so that's what we're doing. So on a day-to-day basis, this year really, it's been a lot of legal structuring. It's kind of in the wheelhouse of a lawyer and my kind of partner in crime, who's co-leading this, has a deep knowledge of financial institutions and the financial industry. So we really started with the difficult stuff that people don't want to think about when you're talking about putting something on chain, like, how do you record title and still have a transfer of ownership on chain? What about insurance? How do you deal with inspections? Like all of that kind of nitty gritty, that's been what we're dealing with this year, but the ultimate upshot of that is that we got to a product where you actually can purchase a single family rental home with one click using a standard NFT smart contract. So that's the transaction. You can buy it on OpenSea, you can buy it on our marketplace, you can buy it on any other NFT marketplace, and you can buy it with crypto. So that's, there have been, extending your question a little bit, but, that's really kind of the background on who we are and what we're doing. And so that's the first phase, which we just launched, announced last week, that first property is available for sale. And then the next phase will be adding some type of financing option to that.
And how do you anticipate scaling this? So you mentioned you have one property now that is available. Is there a distinctly different path to scaling as there was in sort of this prototyping phase?
Yeah, the scaling, fortunately, that's where Roofstock is really has a competitive moat. We've spent 7 years building out the infrastructure to manage the sourcing and acquisition, renovation, and management of properties at scale. We manage 16,000 homes right now. We've transacted $5 billion of single family rentals. So that's where we're ready to scale. We can buy hundreds of homes literally a month if that's what we want to do, and renovate them and manage them. So it's really now just a question of zeroing in on the product market fit, making sure that this has all of the features that our customers are looking for, and then we can ramp up.
And do you anticipate the way that the majority of the single family home market comes on chain is would it be through like a reverse mortgage HELOC type deal where, I own a $500,000 home, I have 20% down, 80% is in a mortgage that I'm paying interest on in principal. And then I say, hey, most of my net worth, this is like an individual perspective, most of my net worth is in this house. I want to have some diversification. Let me sell off 40% of what I own in this house and de-risk. Is that kind of the general financial motivation that people will have that pushes this thing to mainstream?
Yeah, there are a number of different motivating factors. So that structure is definitely something that we want to get to, the functional equivalent of a HELOC, as you said. And what we want to do is use the DeFi ecosystem as a way to prove that that can be a viable alternative to the traditional bank lenders. So what we see there would be, right, you have a house that's unencumbered. You bought it as a token or you want to tokenize it. And then as soon as you have done that, you have a token that can be pledged to a lender. And the lender, you can borrow, against your token. And that can all be done on chain, and that can be done without necessarily even having the personal underwriting of your credit. It can just be based on the value of your asset. So we do see that in the near term. Other types of fractional ownership models, we definitely looked at. Most of those would lead to this being a security under securities laws. And so we've been careful in our side of things to structure around that. Although if someone wanted to buy our home tokens and then create their own fund or somehow fractionalize them after they've purchased them, and that's their distribution model, then that could be done as well.
And the tokens, walk me through a little bit from a legal perspective, how we would go from effectively, it has to be government or state recognized property ownership, right? That's the one thing that, assures people that, hey, no one else can just walk in and kick me out, is that there's, the military and the state government behind it, federal, whoever's behind it. But then there's a series of documents and ledgers that kind of lead up to the canonical source for me being the owner of the house. Is that what the title is? And how did we move from the current structure to on-chain?
Yeah, that's the core question in all of this. Do you have a legally enforceable ownership interest or not?
Right.
I mean, there's no point to do all of this and then find out that if you go to a judge and ask him to enforce your right, they're not going to recognize it, right? So yeah, I mean, the legal enforceability is key. The way that we've done that is we title each home in an LLC. So that initial process of settling the home, titling it, recording that title with the local county registrar, that all happens. We haven't changed the law and the legislation that relates to property ownership. So we still have to work within that. Hopefully one day we could think about land titles being a registry on a blockchain, right? But that's a number of years into the future, and that requires a lot of things to change. But right now we're working with what we have. So that means putting it into an LLC, and then that LLC ownership interest is actually what's represented on chain. I mean, technically, legally, what's happening is if I sell that home token to you, that transaction on the blockchain actually serves as the notification to the LLC to update its books and records with a new owner. So by virtue of that transacting online, we're listening to the blockchain. We see that one of our tokens was sold, changed hands, and that automatically causes the LLC to update its books and records to reflect the new owner. So that's how we manage to get to a one-click transaction, even though, we still have to respect the existing home ownership, property recordation mechanics.
Yeah. In this scenario, I don't see that as being a significant negative attribute. The fact that your bookkeeping ledger is just listening to the blockchain, like ultimately the big value add here, the big unlock is the fact that there's now a massive liquidity pool of people who, retail and institutional, want to invest in like my home or my community's home, or however people are strategically investing. It just unlocks new. So to me, it doesn't really matter how that happens, as long as you can guarantee, like you said, if you were ever in front of a judge, that you do have recognized ownership, which it sounds like going through the LLC. So let me just restate it, and you tell me if I'm correct here. So that when you're purchasing, you as the fund are purchasing a home, you're doing so through an LLC. So a shell company is being created, that company is funded, and then it purchases the home. And whoever owns the LLC owns the property designated for that LLC. I would imagine you have one LLC per property. So then, right, okay. And so you just kind of have this machine that spins up LLCs as kind of umbrella or shell companies. So if I were to own 2% of the LLC, that means I own 2% of the property. And now, however the LLC determines who owns 2% is really up to the LLC's operating agreement, right? So you would just specify, okay, we're going to update this based on blockchain smart contract transactions.
That's exactly right. At the moment, we're not offering the fractional shares. So it's one person, one LLC, one property. And the fractionalization is definitely possible and almost trivial as a technical matter once it's on chain. It does create other issues like securities laws and tax partnerships and things like that. So even though that's possible at the moment, we're just starting with a more vanilla version, which is if you buy that token, then you have the full ownership of that property. And that's, as the base case, that's where we're starting. And then we can think about more exotic structures in the future.
How long do you think it'll be before, if somebody had 100K, that they could put $1,000 into 100 cities in the United States using smart contracts?
Yeah, that's not far. I think that actually exists right now. There are a number of companies that we're aware that have that model. You can invest for as little as $50 in a house, and if you wanted to spread that out over multiple houses, you could do that. Also, we have a project at Roofstock, which is right now it's not tokenized. It's just a security. It's a REIT. That also allows you to invest in targeted areas, a small amount, and so that actually exists. Is the short answer. The trick there is that with the co-ownership of single-family rental homes, diversified ownership can be tricky, because if that needs a new roof and you have 100 owners, but only 25 of them show up with cash to fix the roof or replace the roof, what do? There's a governance issue there. And then it also becomes a partnership for tax purposes, which means everyone has to get a K1. And so it's not that it doesn't exist or it's not a viable model, but it's more complicated than you might initially think. So I would say if that's what you're looking to do, we have a product called Roofstock One, right, RS1, which is a REIT, and it solves all those issues that I just mentioned. It doesn't have capital calls. It doesn't have anything related to partnership because it's a REIT. So that's actually, I think, the best solution for fractional ownership of SFRs on the market right now. And that is a roadmap item for us to tokenize that. But then it becomes a little bit different than what we're doing now, because it has to fit into the securities ecosystem.
Mm. And where do you see the biggest unlock here from an economic perspective? I mean, if you were to say anybody could move money into crypto and they could purchase properties, fractional ownership from any just throw this out there in theory, any property in the entire world, if that were possible, what changes? Do you like, what are the macro effects? Do you think there's a massive influx of investment bankers getting into like small deals, or like what sort of shifts do you anticipate?
I mean, I would hope the institutions are well represented in SFR right now, at least in the U.S. And they bring a lot of advantages. You know, they do put in a fairly significant rehab budget up front of $20,000-$30,000. Like there's an advantage, but we have always hoped that this would expand to the retail sector as well. So if you have, especially with blockchain, it gets a lot easier. Our system, you do have to be KYC, so we need to know that we're not selling to a sanctioned person. But other than that, if you're in Europe or Asia or South America and you want access to the single family housing space in the US, you actually have that right now through our product. We have a property in South Carolina. If I'm in a foreign country and I want that property, literally I can buy that with crypto, again, after going through KYC, and take ownership of that without having to go through the usual network, of multiple, probably a dozen intermediaries and international wire transfers and conversion and bank loan here and there. That, I think that's the ultimate goal, is we want everyone to have access to this. And then to your other question about if any property anywhere in the world were available, we would also want this to be something that is cross border. So if I'm sitting here in the Bay Area and I want exposure to a single family property in Japan, we would like to be able to provide that. That is a future roadmap. But each one of those foreign countries has its own legal issues that we'd have to solve. So it's kind of crawl, walk, run.
Yeah. I want to kind of ask you a little bit more about that point you made earlier around the roof. So if the person living in the home has a distinctly different relationship with the home than the person that owns it. And in the case of a renter, that relationship is well worn, right? Like, I own the house, you rent the house, you live in the home. There's a set of rules, what you can do, what you can't do. You can paint the walls, you can, trim this, you can put up the picture, but you can't cut down that. And it kind of varies, and that lease agreement is set by the owner. And the owner's interest is, I want cash flow and I want you to not destroy the house, because when you leave, I want to be able to rent it again. And so given those premises, does it change when the number of owners are so vast that there's no kind of central point person that takes responsibility, and therefore no one ultimately has enough at stake here? Like, do you see the dynamics changing in a way that's like, what are the traps that people should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, the co-ownership aspect of it does present those governance issues, and that's why we would recommend, if people, that's first of all why we're starting with kind of one owner, one property, but also if people wanted this to be owned by a group, of co-investors or friends, they could potentially do that on their side. After they've purchased it, they can separate that out as much as they want. I think the solution there is, again, assuming that it's a rental property and it's not something where people are like have a shared living situation. If it's a rental property, the solution is get a property manager. There are plenty, and we can serve that role. We also put you in touch with others that can do that work, because you do want that level of professional management. As soon as you start to dispute, well, okay, we have a roof that's going to cost $2,000 to repair, but it only has 2 years of useful life, so we could actually spend $12,000 and get a new roof instead of repairing it. Everyone is going to have a different view on how they want to spend their money and when. It's much better to have a property manager that can help you think through those issues. And again, the way that we've structured this, it's more those kind of management decisions should be made by the owner themselves, as opposed to us. If we're there as a property manager, we can help kind of give you the options, but we do want the owner to actually be making the decision because, again, to avoid any securities laws concerns, they have to kind of be responsible for any returns, profit and loss that they make on the property or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. I live in Portland, Oregon, and in Vancouver, not far away, there is, Vancouver, Canada, not Washington. There is, when I went up there recently, there was a lot of talk, particularly in the Ubers that I was in. They were very critical of the investments that were coming into real estate, particularly commercial real estate, but also some high-end residential from China. And I guess the dynamic is that wealthy individuals in China want to flight out of the Chinese yuan, or at least the government influence or control over that, and they invest in property as a means to hold it. Well, the downside is that people living in the city look up and there's a bunch of empty buildings. Like people are buying these properties and then just not even renting them because it's not even worth the rental income. And so that brought up the conversation of, well, where is the line? Because ultimately, if there's a price that people pay who are living in the city, ideally the people investing in the properties want the flourishment and growth of the city to happen. So then the property goes up. So that's why we get excited about this idea. But then there's also like a slight conflict of interest where, like the NIMBY idea, like don't build it in my backyard. I kind of want to keep things the way they are. Or the other way around, the other end of the spectrum is I'm gonna buy some high-end real estate and not even invest anything into it or even staff it, allow people to live in it. Are those valid examples? Do you see other examples where there's kind of a conflict of interest between owners and people living in the houses or communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I've heard of that in Vancouver as well. And actually the last residential house that I sold, I was surprised. It was sold to a foreign investor and it sat vacant for 18 months in a bull market when rents were very high. And clearly that's what happened. Someone just bought it and said, okay, I have my money in a stable asset. I don't want to deal with, fixing a kitchen sink for a tenant or something. So I'll just keep it vacant. There are a lot of jurisdictions in the U.S. that are starting to regulate that because that, especially with the housing crisis being what it is right now in the U.S. and a massive shortage of housing, I think that's not something that we should be excited about. These are properties that are meant to be useful properties and homes for people. If you're looking for just a pure wealth preservation play, there are plenty of other financial products that you can look for. I wouldn't encourage that. I think the attractiveness of this asset from an economic standpoint is that it has two different income streams potentially. One is the monthly rent, which is translated in the form of a yield on an annual basis, which maybe that's it's 5 or 10 whatever percent that you're getting on your money, and then there's an appreciation play over time, which you could kind of think of this as a bond that has a recurring coupon payment plus an equity kicker at the end. So that's why the single family rental home and other residential real estate is interesting from a financial perspective. And I wouldn't encourage people to buy it and keep it vacant. That's not really the point. Maybe you buy it and let your mother-in-law live in it, or you buy it and use it as a vacation property. But real estate is supposed to be used, and at the moment in this country, we need as much housing stock as possible.
Yeah. So do you think, granted that when someone makes this decision to buy a property and then leave it vacant, they're clearly willing to accept the negative economic factor of not having it be rented in exchange for the stability of it, or maybe just the specific properties of this place itself. I wouldn't imagine most people are doing that. That's probably going to be like high-end foreign investors that come in. But sometimes that wave is huge, and sometimes it can like significantly alter a city. I doubt that that's going to be many cities, or at least many cities significantly. I wonder, like my general philosophy on debating or thinking through legal or regulatory decisions is start with nothing. Start with like what nature does is like there's no laws in nature, right? There's
Yeah.
physics, but there's not like if you go to a jungle, it's like there's no rules. So start there and say, okay, the United States, say if we take property, anybody anywhere could buy at any time and own any, like anything can happen. And then as laws happen, as how would you say this? Like as non-intentional negative externalities manifest, then you layer in rules on top of that.
Totally.
One of the problems, obviously, is that these rules tend to become outdated, and the problem no longer exists, but the rule exists. Is there sort of a set of guidelines or like a philosophical compass you have when thinking through what the correct regulatory like framework is for this? Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's along the lines of what you described. I mean, we do see in this space, and we work across dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different municipalities, and we see a lot of regulations that have sprung up, or call it accreted over generations or hundreds of years. I mean, basically, the land titling system that we have now dates back to England 600 or 700 years ago, right? And the intermediaries in the transaction process right now, if you break it down, all that you're supposed to have in a real estate transaction, you have two concerns. One, the buyer wants to make sure that they're getting the house that they think they're getting, and two, the seller wants to make sure that they get paid. Like literally, that's it. And when you unpack it, you have a constellation of third parties that have come into the system to ensure that those two things happen. But you don't, if you're a forward-thinking policymaker, it is the right time to start thinking about unpacking that formula the way that things have been done for a long time. It doesn't need to be done like that anymore. Blockchain is a perfect example. The whole process of creating escrow, for example, that again, that goes to the settler wanting to make sure that they get paid. The way that we've designed it using smart contracts, it's simply a smart contract function. It's, does the seller have the home token in their wallet? Does the buyer have enough crypto in their wallet? And are they both KYC? If yes, it transacts, and you don't need a third party to hold someone's money. You don't need an earnest money deposit. You don't need any of that because the transaction happens in real time. So I do think that regulations are necessary. Of course, tenant protection, all of that stuff is necessary. But thinking, the way that the laws have evolved, there are a lot of things that are on the books that don't need to be anymore. And what we're asking regulators to think about is, let's not make little changes around the edges. Let's think about what can be true given this new technology that literally never existed before. That smart contract mechanism that I just described, that literally hasn't existed before and can only exist with a blockchain smart contract. So that's the way that we think about it. We know that there are a lot of incumbents, that there are a lot of policy reasons for X, Y, or Z. But if you're looking at it from a position of how can I make the transactions faster and more transparent and better for everyone involved, you kind of we're at the point where it's time to start with a blank slate and work our way up, as you described, instead of, okay, we have, these 575 regulations that apply. Let's figure out which 3 that we should change. No, like throw them all out and let's start again.
Yeah. One thing I want to dig in a little bit with you. You mentioned kind of quickly there, but the tenant regulations are obviously good. How do you come to, not necessarily implying that they're not, but how do you arrive at that conclusion? Say, for instance, living in Santa Monica, California, rent control is a big deal. And just to frame it a little bit, rent control controls the percentage rate that a It controls, I think, just the percentage rate that an owner can increase on the tenant for the property. And I think the number is around 3%. So even if the market were to, boom, there could be someone, and the part of this that gets really unfortunate is when somebody who is full, and it's not connected to your income. So you could be making $1 million a year and have signed up for rent for some property on a beachfront property in Santa Monica 15 years ago, and you're still paying like an incredibly low amount. So how is this good? Like, what are your thoughts on just
okay, policy? Perfect. Thank you for pushing on that. I didn't have the rent control in mind, and speaking for myself, not my company, I think the rent control policies are very misguided. I think we do need affordable housing, but pushing that cost onto individual property owners is completely the wrong way to do it. As a society, we need affordable housing. Okay, let's go find a way to create affordable housing, but requiring an individual property owner to take a hit to subsidize a policy goal for society as a whole, I don't think that makes any sense. Again, that's my own personal opinion. What I was referring to, though, is things like how you manage a security deposit that a tenant's given you. Like how do you make sure that that tenant, when they move out, isn't going to be in a situation when the landlord says, "Oh, I spent your money. Sorry, I can't give you your deposit back." Or, basic questions of habitability, like, making sure that there's heating in the winter and, clean running water. That's what I was talking about in terms of tenant protections. But I do think that I'm talking about habitability and, having a healthy and decent place to live, as opposed to imposing, societal externalities on individual landlords.
Yeah, you mentioned the two simplest aspects of the buy and sell transaction. Seller wants their money, buyer wants what they signed up for. I tend to look at that as like, if the buyer signs up for a property and they know it doesn't have AC, or it doesn't have, whatever people think it should have, bring it up and you have a case to be made, right? This is, in the lease agreement, it said it was going to have AC. AC is not working. You refuse to fix it as the owner. Therefore, like, I can escalate that or I can leave. And I view the escalation process as the legislative, or really the judicial system, right? So I also view it as part of the reason why I think most people would agree with you on we need affordable housing. If you trace that, like if you go upstream to why do we need affordable housing? Why is the free market not capable of building housing for people who are on the lower income sector, which is usually people who are younger, like the age is the strongest corollary to income. I tend to view it's because we have things like rent control. Like the fact that you can make $2 million and pay, next to nothing for rent because you've been there a long time. It's like, that's the kind of thing that artificially pushes up the cost to everyone else. Cause now the market is artificially constrained and, when limited supply, prices go up. There's a quick thing I learned in New York. In New York, there is a percentage of the property in a building, that residential apartment building, that the owners have to allocate towards low income housing. Good intention policy. The ramifications are the vast majority of owners don't even rent those out. They just give them to friends and family, or they rent them to friends and family at very, very low rates, because there's also policies that say you can't evict people. And these policies, while they sound nice, it's like set a really high minimum wage. It just puts a tremendous amount of pressure on like automating people out of their jobs or not doing what the law intended. So the more I learn about good intention laws, the more I see them as the root cause of the problems that we're looking at. Like
totally. And I'm in California, which is one of the hotspots for Nimbyism, right? Especially related to housing. Everyone wants to have their own space and they don't want it to change and they like it the way it's been. But we can't have growing and thriving communities without rethinking the use of land and the way that it's been done. But that's absolutely quashed by the existing incumbents everywhere, right? The existing property owners everywhere uniformly use whatever they can to avoid having the dense housing, or to allow someone to construct an in-law suite in the backyard. Housing regulations are used at the local level to prevent growth, even though as a society we need more housing stock. So totally agree with you on that point.
Okay, so let's take that for an example. So people say take a blank slate, like it's the Wild West. There's just open prairies. People come out there, they build a little town, and then they have their town, and they say, okay, we as town owners, we've settled this land, we built this property, it's legally ours. We don't want any more building. Now, if you were to do that, then anybody who wants to move into town would have to it'd be very expensive to do so, because you'd have to pay a lot to get access to the very small percentage of the land available to build. It just seems to me that if you just follow that line of thinking, people would go build elsewhere. Like, there seems to be, like, how do you view the Nimbyism as a problem?
The problem is that it happens in population centers, right? That's where the jobs are. And so in the Bay Area, or in LA or San Diego or the other major population centers, that's where the economic, until COVID hit, right? And everyone had to be in their seat for their job. It literally, if you want a job, then your best chance is at one of the population centers where there's a lot of economic activity. And therefore you need to be, within driving distance of that. And over time, you can see, in San Francisco, like Mill Valley, which is right across the bay from San Francisco, it used to be kind of a hippie-ish kind of center in the 60s, and then it developed, and now it's very sought after. But you could say the same of any, county outside of LA or anywhere else, until at some point, the next level of building, you're building a community that's a 2-hour drive outside of the city, which again, that means that the person that's coming into that community, which is a lower cost community, they actually then have to go spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours commuting every day just for the benefit of having a job in that community. And that's where things get tricky, because yes, you could just go to some uninhabited place. There's plenty of land in the US that's completely vacant, and you could decide, look, we're going to create our city here. But to make that happen, a lot of things have to be true. You need more than the local bakery and dry cleaner. You need some corporate or government or athletic center of gravity that's going to bring people there. And then after time, all of the ancillary activities grow. So it's not as easy, unfortunately, as let's build some ancillary cities. Yeah, that could theoretically, that's a good plan, but that's measured in like generations.
Right. Do you see this as I'm not sure if you have your radar on other countries, but do you see Nimbyism playing out in other places as well? Like, is this a sort of an evolutionary process of human civilizational development, or is this somehow like a tumor on the regulatory structure of our American property system?
No, it's a tumor on the human condition.
Yeah.
I mean, like I remember seeing some map of an ancient Egyptian city, and sure enough, in the desirable city center, you had bigger homes that were owned by the wealthy. And then as you got farther out, you had smaller, more compact housing right next to the city dump. Like that existed a long time ago, and that instinct is pervasive everywhere. Are there societies that have dealt with it better? Probably. I'm not up to speed enough to, compare and contrast. But yeah, I think here in the US in particular, we have at least 3 levels of government that make things complicated, right? We have the federal, and then we have state, and then we have local. And so, a local municipality is trying to make a decision, also can be constrained by the state laws, and can also be constrained by federal environmental laws, or, any other a federal concern. So it's difficult here because you have three layers. And if a community has a particular burning need to do whatever they think they're doing, whether building or getting an exception to a rule, it could be impossible to take it all the way up the chain, first to the state legislature and then to some federal agency. That definitely complicates things in our more decentralized system.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about, so kind of elaborating on the idea of crypto, you have many different mechanisms that are possible because of blockchain, one of which is crowdfunding territory. So I think about this, is it possible to crowdfund territory using a online cryptocurrency community that is pre-established? And instead of thinking about this as like most people would say, this is a book that was Appleology wrote this book called The Network State, which is it's in line with this thinking, which is that instead of say, okay, let's start a new country by go getting land, that's the last thing you do. First is you build a community, you establish your guideline, your set of principles, your doctrine, so to speak. You attract people to the community, you crowdfund, and you could do this all decentralized on chain. And if you were to do that, I wonder if it's possible in the US to write a set of rules. I feel like property laws are the most important laws to start with because they're literally what you need to be able to physically construct the world that you're living in. And so I just wonder if there's an opportunity to like write up, here's our policy when it comes to property. Here's our policy for amending this policy. And we're going to carve off like a sanctuary space in rural, I don't know, Nebraska somewhere, and you identify this area. Do you think it's possible for the state and the federal government to allow kind of a sanctuary, they have sanctuary states or sanctuary cities? Could it be possible to have like a sanctuary determined property zone from a legal perspective? Like, do you see that as being possible?
It is possible. I do think it's possible. And it's actually more than possible. People have tried to do that. There have already been a few DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which sometimes aren't decentralized and sometimes aren't autonomous. But the whole concept is it permits a type of governance that isn't possible elsewhere because it's all on chain. It's based on your ownership percentage of the tokens, or it's based on how much you contribute to the community. It's basically kind of going back to ground zero and thinking about how would we do things differently if we were rebuilding everything now using a new system of decision making, which is a blockchain. And so there have been projects that successfully raised money and acquired property, and have kind of mapped out some of the things that you mentioned in terms of this is how we're going to use the property and this is what it takes to be a decision maker here. And it's all, a lot of that is tied to, a token that you might own either because you purchased it or because it's been a reward for what you contributed to the community. We're really talking about a new way of human governance. All of the same issues that we have in today's system of governance still exist because human nature is still the same thing. And you have free riders, you have people who say that they want to vote but don't vote. You have, after a vote is taken, you actually have to have someone that does the work. It's one thing just to vote, but then who's actually doing that? So all of these things have to be kind of rethought and retested. But it's happening right now. It's happening both in the US and outside of the US. There are a number of different real estate development projects that are based on funding from crypto and making decisions using a DAO structure. Very interesting to see what's going on. And in some ways, it kind of crosses over with like political science theory and the best way to have a representative democracy. We're really looking at a different way of organizing human behavior because of blockchain, which hasn't been possible before.
Yeah. Do you know offhand what those projects are, or even just generally how far along any of them are that are far along?
I mean, Unfortunately, a handful of them, they got a lot of press, turned out to be either in unable to execute because of the skills of the people involved, or really just a scam. So and then there are a few that I think are ongoing that I can certainly get you those names that are at different stages of development. And I think I see people, I do participate in some of these DAOs, and I see people trying really, with the best faith imaginable to make this new system work. But the land use laws are the core, and some states are refreshingly open-minded about that. Like Wyoming, for example, has made a lot of steps towards being a more crypto-friendly regulatory regime. And I've heard some talk about, potentially changing the land registry system there to be based on blockchain. Again, with anything, there are so many incumbents, but it's those types of things are state level decisions. And I do have hope that in some of these smaller states in particular, where there are fewer interests to defend against, I think some progress can be made. We can have a new type of property ownership structure and a new type of governance structure that goes with it.
Yeah, interesting. I hope it happens soon. I think that's one of the beauties of the United States, is that it really is united individual states that can, hopefully continue to make a lot of the independent decisions that are experimental, and then see what works, right? It's like that is the one major advantage to the structure. So I'm definitely on the side of like less centralized federal power and more on the states.
Yes.
Obviously it's like topic by topic, but for property, it seems like it makes the most sense.
And I think there's no doubt, right? I mean, it's kind of composed of a lot of little laboratories that together create the society that we live in, and the federal structure on top of that. But yeah, the decisions are supposed to be made nearest the people who are affected by the decisions. And if you let people come up with their own ways of governing, you see a lot of new ideas out there that you wouldn't necessarily think about. And maybe that's something that you want to adopt for your local governance as well.
Yeah. I think there's my last thought on this on my side is I feel like there's kind of like a gaping opportunity for a new style of political leadership that really underscores the root causes of the problem and takes on less of the traditional hey, we're gonna fix this problem using government, as opposed to like, no, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the problem exists because we have too much government, and that I'm interested to see, because places like San Francisco, places like LA, there's some spots that are just, the current policies are so obviously wrong in some way. Like, you can dissect and talk about what it is, but clearly we're doing something wrong. So yeah.
Totally agree. It's one of the oddities of the system we're in right now, that you have, somehow a correlation between someone's views on abortion that correlates to their views on what the interest rate should be.
Is that right?
The base rate. Like, what? This can't be a smart way to make decisions, guys. You just don't lump things like that together. So I totally agree. Like, let's look at the root causes. And I think probably 95% of people agree that we need to fix the root cause of homelessness or poverty or whatever it is. And what we're bringing kind of these antiquated ideological structures into the conversation, and it just pollutes it. Just look at the facts. There are ways to solve these issues. They've been tested. Let's use what's been tested. Let's be scientific about it, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, I'm excited about what you guys are building. Do you want to throw out any personal places you're writing or tweeting? We'll have all the links for Roofstock in the show notes, but are you actively online anywhere?
Yes, I am at, you can find me at _G Thompson on Twitter. And that's the main channel right now. Also, on LinkedIn, bouncing around all kinds of Discord channels. But that's the main place that you can find me.
Sweet. Thanks, Geoff. This has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your time, man.
Thank you. Likewise.